Okay, hey guys. Today we're going to be talking about Standard 5.1, which is going to involve American expansionism, isolationism, and imperialism. Some of these things we discussed. If you had me last year, we went over some of these things. We're going to be going into the American side of it. I know last year we went into the world history side of it, but we're going to be focusing on the American side of imperialism and expansionism and isolationism. Let's look at the term U.S. imperialism first, and let's actually do a definition for it. Imperialism, again, is the extension of power over another nation, building an empire, also referred to as interventionism. And sometimes you'll see that term pop up either in the EOC workbook. You might see it if you look in the textbook, but sometimes you see that. So a couple of things, too, we're going to focus on as we travel through this lesson. Of course, number one, you do need to know what imperialism is, how the United States eventually becomes known as an imperialistic nation, and what were going to be some of their policies leading up to World War One. But these are going to be some things that are going to be addressed in this lesson. So let's look at some of these things. Intervention before the late 1800s. If we look at what the United States was doing, they had westward expansion. Of course, manifest destiny, the idea of going from ocean to ocean, from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and controlling all of that land. It was God's destiny, or our destiny as a country, to control most of that land. Of course, the United States was acquiring new territories and new states during this process. They were spreading democracy to all these new areas. And then, of course, this was all termed under manifest destiny and the idea of expansionism. So those were the things that were going on in the United States before or by the late 1800s. And so after the late 1800s, things began to change. The United States, of course, was industrializing, so they wanted new markets to sell these new goods to. So industrialization is going to play a major role in imperialism. And of course, too, with industrialization, they needed the resources to use in the factories and to make and produce things. They were looking at new territories, places that weren't states like Alaska and Hawaii, which is sort of outside of what they would call the contiguous United States, or the lower 48. And all of this becomes known as imperialism after the late 1800s. Again, here's one of the political cartoons and some drawings and things that showed up during this period. And of course, you see how Great Britain was often portrayed as an imperialistic nation. Remember, we said the sun never sets on the British Empire because the British controlled so much. Of course, they're portraying Britain as an octopus. And then, of course, you look at the other one to the right there, and you see the United States encircling the globe, showing how the United States was also becoming an imperialistic nation. Let's look at some of the things that the United States were using as reasons for them to actually imperialize or focus on interventionism. First, of course, nationalism, which we've talked about in the past. The United States had the idea, of course, they wanted to be the best. They want to be known as the best. The need for raw materials for that industrial complex that was starting to build in the United States. Again, they were trying to expand capitalism. They were seeking new markets to sell their goods, mainly due to industrialization. We talked about the Navy, which I think we mentioned in one of the classes earlier, but remember how the United States had created a large Navy really under Theodore Roosevelt, but they wanted to show that Navy off. They knew if they had naval power, then they could travel to all these different places and exert their power over some of those places. Social Darwinism, which we discussed in the last standard. Remember, the United States began to view themselves as being the dominant force, or wanted to be the dominant force Remember, social Darwinism, survival of the fittest, that the strong countries at this point would survive. And then the final reason would have been because of religious obligation or religious duty. The U.S. had the idea, too, of spreading Christianity to some of these foreign lands. Again, social Darwinism, which we've discussed in the past, survival of the fittest. We talked about it in business, but it also can be applied here. That some of these stronger countries needed to control some of these weaker and smaller countries. If one nation falls to another, it's because they were too weak. So again, this is the idea of social Darwinism. It supports the idea that Americans saw themselves as superior to everyone else, and that began to take place during the late 1800s and early 1900s. Fit nations prosper, weak nations fall. Of course, like I just mentioned a few minutes ago, how the United States would try to dominate other countries. They are dominating them because they look at them as being weaker. And of course, this is using that policy of social Darwinism. One place that the United States began to look to shortly after the Civil War was Alaska. Alaska was originally owned by Russia, and of course, it is part of the North American continent. The United States would pursue Alaska from Russia in the 1860s, and they purchased it for $7 million. Alaska at this point was big in fur, land, and eventually later gold. The Klondike Gold Rush happens, an area within Alaska where gold had been found, and a lot of people went to Alaska to try to get rich off of gold. Of course, at this time, too, when Alaska was originally purchased, people made fun of the Secretary of State who helped negotiate that purchase. His name was Seward. In fact, they actually referred to Alaska as Seward's icebox. People laughed at him and scoffed at him for buying Alaska, but eventually it pays off for the United States because later on, guess what? There's going to be oil that's going to be discovered there. And once the oil is found, Alaska is really going to take off and be a big purchase for the U.S. It became the 49th state in the year 1959. It was the last land on the North American continent that was added to the United States. If you look at the size of Alaska, you can see how big it is. This is sort of overlaid over the United States. Of course, you've often heard that Alaska is bigger than Texas. Well, you can see it takes up a good chunk of the entire U.S. From the tip of Barrow, Alaska, all the way down to Juneau, which is the capital. 11, well, that's not the capital. From Barrow to Juneau is about 1,100 miles if you had to go from as the crow flies from point to point. From New York to Orlando, Florida is 1,100 miles, which you can see here on the map. During the age of imperialism, the United States began to dominate and take off, like we've already mentioned. They began to make land purchases like what we just talked about with Alaska. There was more land to gain. One of the areas that the U.S. was really focused on were some of the islands in the Pacific. Eventually, one of those islands becomes part of the United States and Hawaii. We're actually going to gain Hawaii later on. And they were looking at some places to try to help other countries, and I won't say help, but to try to get these other countries to either break away or to rebel, so the United States could eventually control them. So they helped in foreign liberation movements, and that's the reason why they were trying to get these other countries to break away to eventually try to control them later on. They knew that if they got some of these countries to break away from whoever was controlling them, that they could make them dependent on them or they could use them as allies. This is the period when the United States is considered to make that jump from being, a fairly strong country to becoming a world power. So the age of imperialism, very important for the perspective of how the United States is going to view itself and how the rest of the world is going to view itself. That's the end of Standard 5.1. We're going to go on to 5.2 and talk a little bit about the Spanish-American War, which we have discussed in the past, beginning with the causes of the Spanish-American War. One of the main causes, naturally, is the sinking of the USS Maine. The USS Maine was stationed in Havana Harbor. It was sunk when it ran into a mine. The United States becomes outraged over this and eventually declares war. Actually, though, it seems like that whole situation was really just an accident. The United States might have gone to war for something that was simply an accident. Again, here's a picture showing you the Maine exploding in Havana Harbor. Part of the reason why the Spanish-American War happens is, we've said, the USS Maine, but also yellow journalism. And yellow journalism is sort of like sensationalism, where stories are really sort of over-exaggerated and created to stir emotion within people. And there were a lot of yellow journalists during this period. Again, sensationalist writing to arouse emotion. Shocking stories, usually there were half-truths to it. It wasn't necessarily totally true. And because of all these yellow journalists, people began to read these things in the newspapers and they began to believe some of these things. And it helped these yellow journalists began to push for the idea of going to war with Spain, against Spain. Here's a couple of pictures. You can see how they portrayed Spain in that political cartoon, the Spanish Brute. And then also, too, you can see the newspaper down at the bottom from the New York Journal. Again, Spanish ships on our coast. Who knows if that was really true? How men died in vain or died for the flag, which is Old Glory, which you see pictured there as well. The other reason why the Spanish-American War happens, and this is the third reason, was because many Americans were sympathetic to help Cubans. They saw it as a way to help these poor people out of the situation that they were in, that the Spanish were being mean to them. So they had a humanitarian view of helping those oppressed by the Spanish regime. Again, another picture sort of displaying Uncle Sam, protecting the Cubans against the Spanish. Save me from my friends, which you see Uncle Sam standing over this young lady. Fourth reason that the Spanish-American War happens is something known as the Delome Letter. This was written by the Spanish ambassador who referred to President McKinley as being weak. He says McKinley is a low politician, weak and catering to the rabble. So the Delome Letter really fired people up as well. Newspaper competition to try to get the best story out there eventually led to this letter being put in the newspapers. And once it was, you can imagine some of the outrage, and you can also imagine how McKinley probably felt about it as well. Again, this is a picture of Cuba, showing you where it's located, of course, right off our coast. And we're not going to tolerate someone doing the things that Spain supposedly was doing in our neck of the woods. So again, it eventually is going to lead to war. Results of this war, it doesn't last very long. It only lasts a few months. The United States is pretty quick to defeat Spain. But some of the things that are going to come out of this, number one, the United States is going to annex the island of Hawaii. They're also going to take Manila Harbor in the Philippines. And the reason why they wanted both of these places was because both of these places would be huge for fueling purposes for ships and eventually being, sort of jumping off spots in case they needed to address any problems in that part of the globe. Second reason or second result of the war was the United States felt a moral responsibility to help the people of the Philippines. Like we just said, they went to Manila Harbor. Eventually, the United States is going to control the Philippines. They said the Filipinos needed help from the United States, that they didn't need to be controlled by Spain at this point, and they needed to help out. And of course, this political cartoon showing you in this slide shows you how the United States sort of viewed these people in the Philippines and in Cuba and some of these other areas that we eventually are going to take over due to this war. Third reason or third result was U.S. ownership of the Philippines. We get Wake Island, which will play a major role in World War II. Guam also plays another major role during World War II. Puerto Rico, which is still a U.S. territory today, and Cuba. So all of those places become under the control of the United States.